Previously in the North African Campaign series, we've seen the Italians advance into Egypt, only to be thrown back during Operation Compass, Britain's greatest forgotten victory of the war, which saw the British reach the El Agheila area. Rommel then landed in Africa and launched his first offensive, driving the British back to Tobruk and the Egyptian frontier. Failing to take Tobruk, Rommel resisted the British offensives of Operation Brevity and Battle Axe, but was driven back during Operation Crusader, the most insane battle ever. He fell back across Libya to the El Agheila area once again. Then Rommel launched his second offensive, forcing the British back to the Gazala line, where he defeated them in a tough battle that saw both sides lose a lot of tanks. The British retreated towards the Egyptian frontier, and Rommel then surrounded Tobruk for a second time, which is where we are now. With the Battle of Gazala over, on the 18th of June 1942, the same day that Rommel's forces had surrounded the port, Rommel gave the orders for an attack on Tobruk, which would begin on the 20th of June. At this point, the British only had one tank formation in combat outside the pocket, the 4th Armoured Brigade, and this was limping back towards the Egyptian frontier with between 44 and 66 tanks. Auchinleck was still hoping to counterattack and relieve Tobruk, but when he flew to see Ritchie, the situation became clear. There was nothing left to mount that counterattack with. So Tobruk was left to defend itself, which wasn't good because Tobruk's defences, originally constructed by the Italians under Marshal Balbo with a double ring of concrete works around the port, had been neglected. The anti-tank ditch hadn't been maintained, much of the barbed wire had been removed, and many of the mines had been lifted out and placed in the Gazala line positions. This was because the British hadn't wanted nor expected a second siege, and it was only Churchill's last-minute decision to hold Tobruk that got them into this mess. During the second siege of Tobruk, the Australians had constructed a second blue line inside the first, but this was only being manned by artillery units this time around. And because the terrain sloped down towards the town of Tobruk, the attackers would have the high ground. Worse, there was a major flaw in the outer ring of defences. The fire positions themselves were unprotected, but the Italians had built a series of underground dugouts that the soldiers could run into to protect them from air and artillery fire. The Australians had decided not to use these underground positions, partly because they were full of fleas, but also because there was only one exit from them, which was a critical design error, as we will see later. Unfortunately for the Allies, in this third siege, the British, South Africans and Indian units decided that they would use these underground positions, which would prove to be a disastrous decision. This time, the 2nd South African Division had taken up positions inside Tobruk, and the 2 brigades of the division were inexperienced and not as well trained as the troops of the 1st South African Division. General Hendrik Klopper was inexperienced too, having only just been promoted from brigadier to major general the month before. The previous general of the division, Villiers, had flown back to South Africa, leaving Klopper in charge of a new and inexperienced divisional staff. His brigade commanders were also more experienced than him, which would lead to problems later. Klopper never established his personal ascendancy. Tobruk was commanded in the current British manner by a debating society. 3 other frontline brigades were in Tobruk as well: Willison's 32nd Army Tank Brigade, Johnson's 201st Guards Brigade, and Anderson's 11th Indian Infantry Brigade. But Willison's and Johnson's brigades had been mauled during the Battle of Gazala, and Willison only had 54 or 55 tanks, with another 20 or 30 in repair. These were mostly Valentines with some Matildas mixed in, meaning that they only had 2-pounders in their effectively obsolete tanks. Johnson's 201st Guards Brigade was also a mixed bag. Only 1 battalion, the 3rd Coldstream Guards, had been with this brigade during Gazala. Knight's 1st Worcestershire Regiment had originally been part of the 29th Indian Brigade, and the 1st Sherwood Foresters had only been attached a few days previously. In other words, the brigade was a ragtag force, had no artillery, and Johnson had only just taken command of the brigade on the 16th of June, a few days previously. In fact, he'd only arrived in the Middle East on the 12th. So this guy was not experienced in the desert at all. While the garrison was probably about 35,000 men strong overall, only about 20,000 of these were combat troops. And here's the crucial point. Clopper and the rest of the British command thought that Rommel would attack in the southwestern area of the line, specifically in the Medawar area. Thus, most of the units, including the bulk of the artillery, were deployed to face this attack. But it was actually against Anderson's brigade in the southeast where Rommel's attack would fall. And this shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone. During the first siege against the Italians, O'Connor had attacked in this location. During the second siege, Rommel had attacked in this location too and had prepared to attack it again in this location later during the second siege. There's a reason why the Australians had constructed their second blue line in this area, and yet, because of Gazala, it had been assumed that the attack would come in the west. This, obviously, was a critical mistake. Anderson was an experienced commander, and his subunits were experienced and had a good reputation. These weren't bad troops. The main issue was that the 11th Indian Brigade was about to be attacked by all the armoured units of Rommel's army and was stretched thin over 13 miles in the exact area where most of the mines had been taken away. On an inspection being made, it was found that portions of the minefield were non-existent. The majority of the mines were of Egyptian pattern and had been laid a year previously, with the result that many were defective, and, as proved later, were no real obstacle to the enemy attacking troops. Willison of 32nd Army Tank Brigade had been through the second siege of Tobruk, and he told Clopper in private that changes could be made to the organisation of the forces to strengthen them. In the previous Tobruk siege, all three infantry brigades had been facing outwards, with only some armoured cars patrolling the seafront under Willison's command, who could then call upon tanks for reinforcements if there was a landing. But even though they had more armoured cars this time round, and probably due to inexperience, Clopper had placed the 6th South African Brigade mostly along the coast. The Gurkhas were also partly along the coast as well, spreading out and thinning the troops more than they had been during the previous siege, making the lines easier to penetrate. It's hard to tell because the maps I have are not great, but it appears that in the second siege, the area which is currently occupied by the 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marathas was held by 2 battalions, not 1. Whether the 50th Division at the time realised that this was a weak area of the front and had reinforced it, I'm not sure, but the point is that in the second siege, they had more guys where they needed to be, and I'm not saying that having 2 infantry battalions here would have prevented Rommel from getting through, but the point is that the units on the front line were stretched thin, making Rommel's job that much easier. Clopper accepted Willison's suggestions and thanked him for them, but no changes were made. This has been a great source of criticism since then, but it was probably because there just wasn't enough time to make the changes. Brigadier Johnson of 201st Guards Brigade also suggested that, in the event of an attack, he and Willison's headquarters should be combined into a joint headquarters, since their 2 brigades would be operating together as the reserve force. Again, this was agreed upon, but nothing happened. It's not clear, but it does appear that Clopper thought he'd have more time to prepare than he did. Nobody expected the Axis to attack as soon as they did, and he only had days to prepare. To make matters worse, the maps they were using were from the previous sieges, all of which showed minefields that were no longer there, and Clopper himself was using a captured German map. It also looks like the South Africans were told that the mines were still there by the chief engineer of GOT's 13th Corps before they evacuated. So it looks like they believed that they were protected when in fact they were not. And the entire garrison only had 17 6-pounder anti-tank guns, all but 2 of which were in the 201st Guards Brigade. And there were only 33 2-pounders, and 8 Bofors guns as well, bringing the total to 58 anti-tank guns, which was simply not enough. They were given some bush guns, which were old artillery pieces captured from the Italians, and spigot mortars, but these were unreliable and ineffective at best. They had 18 heavy 3.7-inch anti-aircraft guns and some light South African guns as well, and would have had 18 more of the heavy guns had General Gott not taken them with him when he left a few days previously. But even if he had left them behind, the problem was that the High Command told them not to use these as anti-tank guns, so they generally weren't used. Gott had also taken away the 6 Grant tanks the South Africans had requisitioned for themselves, which could have seriously helped in holding Tobruk, but they were gone. They also had no aircraft, but they did have tons of supplies. In fact, their 17 6-pounders could fire 1,303 rounds each before they ran out of ammunition. Of course, they would never get a chance to fire that many rounds because they would be overwhelmed way before this, but at least they didn't have to be stingy with the anti-tank rounds. They did need to ration artillery shells, however, since they only had 450 per gun, and assuming a 3-month siege, which is what Klopper told his subordinates they would need to hold for, that's just 5 shells per artillery piece per day. And there's evidence that some of this was used up in the days before the siege, as they were targeting Axis units on the perimeter. It's also worth mentioning that the morale of the British troops was low. They had either just taken part in the defeat at Gazala or had seen the troops retreating through Tobruk, which no doubt discouraged them. Several units had just been dumped inside the fortress during the retreat, and much of the rear area was disorganised. Then, to add to the misery, the BBC broadcasted to the world that Tobruk was not vital and might be lost. Although it's not confirmed, the troops probably did hear it, and we know that Klopper did because he sent this message to the 8th Army. I cannot carry on if the BBC is allowed to make these statements. Overnight to the 19th of June 1942, the Desert Air Force was compelled to fall back from Sidi Azeiz to Sidi Barrani, and was now out of range of Tobruk. From this moment onwards, the Tobruk garrison had no air support. The British command knew that the 8th Armoured Division was due to arrive in Egypt at the end of June. The 44th Division would arrive in mid-July, and Tobruk had 90 days worth of supplies, so they still had hopes that they could turn the situation around in that time. Due to their own supply problems, the Axis probably couldn't move forwards if Tobruk held out. And even if Tobruk fell, the British believed that they couldn't advance east of Halfaya, and thus they probably wouldn't be able to move into Egypt without more reinforcements. Reality, of course, would prove them otherwise. Rommel's plan to capture the fortress involved a clever ruse. He bypassed the city initially and made for the Egyptian frontier. This gave the British command the impression that Rommel was not going to launch a frontal attack on the fortress, but was going to resort to another siege. This was exactly the impression that Rommel wanted them to have. Rommel's forces only started moving to their assembly areas in the evening of the 19th of June 1942, which the Afrika Korps complained about since they said there would be confusion in a move like this overnight. It also didn't give them much time to prepare. Still, Rommel insisted that it had to be done. Despite the urgency of the moment, Rommel and his staff had a good laugh that afternoon when his artillery crews found all of their old positions from the previous year sitting empty and intact, often with stockpiles, thousands of shells still sitting nearby. All that was necessary was to back the guns into place, dig them in, then sight and register them. Rommel's plan was to send both his panzer divisions and Kampfgruppe Many from the 90th Light Division against the 2nd Battalion of the 5th Maratha Light Infantry. The Italian 20th Corps would also attack on the left against the Cameron Highlanders. And though they had lost a lot of tanks during Gazala, it seems that the Axis had repaired or replaced a good deal of them, since there were about 125 Axis tanks for the attack on Tobruk. Anderson's men had scouted the area in front of them the night before, and they knew that the bulk of the Axis units were facing the Marathas and Gurkhas. They also heard considerable amounts of movement, alerting them to the impending attack. Then, on the morning of the 20th of June 1942, Auchinleck received intelligence suggesting that Rommel would attack Tobruk from the east. But before the message could be delivered to the garrison, the attack was started. Now, as Playfair notes in the British official history, most of the contemporary accounts of this siege were lost, and therefore historians are forced to rely on personal accounts which aren't ideal. German and British timings don't match up, and so, while the sequence of events is probably correct, the timings of debate, as are some of the details. I've done my best to piece this all together, but in some parts I'm not 100% sure if it's exactly the way it happened in reality, because nobody's entirely certain. So this is the best we can do with the evidence we have available. The Germans used every bomber they had, and even pulled some from Crete, almost exhausting their remaining fuel supplies. To maximise the effectiveness of the air attack, Kesselring himself visited the troops and talked with them in person, which no doubt boosted their morale, and while they only had around 150 bombers for the attack, which wasn't much, the closeness of the airfields meant that the Germans could launch 580 sorties per day, and the Italians 177. So this is why the old accounts, including Rommel's, describe how the Axis bombers came in huge numbers never seen before, making it out as if the Luftwaffe had been strengthened. In reality, the few bombers they did have were launching multiple attacks, making it appear as if they had more than they really did. So, at 5:20 AM on the morning of the 20th of June 1942, the bombers struck the Indian troops on the front lines. 2 Stukas and an Me-111 were lost in accidents, but there were no other losses, even among the Italians. 10 minutes later, at 5:30 AM, German artillery fired, and this combined bombardment was the heaviest seen in the desert so far. It was extremely effective against the Indian troops who ran into their concrete dugouts. It's worth noting that the Germans mistakenly believed that their bombardment was what neutralised the minefields, but as I explained earlier, there were hardly any minefields in this area, so they were mistaken. The Many group then moved up towards the front, and at 7 AM they then attacked, and quickly got across the anti-tank ditch. And this is where the critical flaw in the defences became apparent. Because the Stukas and artillery had driven the Indians into their underground dugouts, and there was only one exit from them, the Germans were able to approach the positions under the cover of the bombardment, and when it lifted, they just stood at the exits, preventing the Indian troops from coming out. The Indian troops were trapped inside and forced to surrender to the Germans without a fight. Both the Germans and Indians were surprised by this because resistance simply didn't materialise due to the way the Italians had built these defences. So, within 5 minutes, 4 of these positions were taken and an entire company of Indians was made prisoner. Then, within about 15 minutes, the first belt of fortifications had been penetrated by the Many group. They were then delayed, not by the Indians, but by their own artillery. When they asked their artillery to move forward in order to allow their attack to progress, the artillery didn't shift their fire. This was probably because they didn't expect the first positions to fall so quickly. Well, they asked again, and the artillery still didn't move. So they asked the forward artillery observer to come forward and advance with them on foot into the artillery fire, after which the artillery finally shifted. Another 6 positions fell rapidly, so that by 7:45 AM, All the positions between points 58 and 69 were in German hands. Group Many had failed to take point 71 on the flank of their attack because of strong supporting fire from point 73, but otherwise the Germans now poured through the defences. The attack had gone according to plan, except that it had succeeded sooner than expected. We had lost a few dead and wounded, but the casualties were relatively light. Now we passed our first prisoners back and went forward. Both 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions started to cross the perimeter, while the Ariete Division had been hit by strong fire coming from the 2nd Camerons. They had managed to get across the anti-tank ditch, but the Italian infantry were getting pummeled, preventing them from taking any of the Indian positions. The Ariete was therefore ordered to follow the German divisions, and this threw off Rommel's plan. Rommel had wanted the Ariete to go towards Fort Pilastrino, but obviously that wouldn't happen, placing the burden entirely on the German panzer divisions. The 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marathas threw their reserves into a counterattack, and Anderson ordered a platoon from the Gurkhas to reinforce them as well. Anderson also informed Klopper that a breach had occurred, but in his report he said that things were in hand. This was clearly an over-optimistic assessment, which reinforced Klopper's belief that this was a feint attack. Klopper still thought Rommel's main attack would come from the southwestern area, not the southeast. So while he told Anderson that tanks and infantry reinforcements were on their way, it's likely that this belief made him procrastinate in his response. The sources say that there was a miscommunication between Brigadiers Johnson and Willison, as well as with General Klopper, about who should lead this counterattack, causing a significant delay of the promised reinforcements. When we look at the details though, Klopper only ordered 1 battalion of tanks and 2 companies of infantry to counterattack. If he thought that this was the main attack, why didn't he send all of the 32nd Army Tank and 201st Guards Brigades in? Clearly, he didn't think that this was the main attack, and thus split up his forces, sending only a portion of his reserves towards the southeast, while keeping the bulk of them watching for an attack to the southwest. So, what happened was, the 3rd Coldstream Guards and a platoon of anti-tank guns were moved to King's Cross, and waited for the tanks to reinforce them in order to mount a counterattack. But Reeves' 4th Royal Tank Regiment took 2.5 hours to get themselves organised and move to King's Cross, again indicating that they didn't think that this was the main attack. And when they did finally meet up with the infantry, Reeves was surprised. He hadn't realised that there would be any infantry accompanying him in this attack, and didn't seem to consider coordinating his actions with them. Thus, Reeves went off ahead to the Blue Line, and the Coldstream Guards waited at King's Cross for events to unfold. Brigadier Anderson later said that he had waited for 2.5 hours for the tanks to arrive, and if the tanks had come an hour earlier, the breach may have been closed. That may also be considered an over-optimistic assessment, but regardless, the 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marathas were destroyed, and the tanks were nowhere to be seen. Actually, a counterattack never developed because the British forces came up piecemeal and without any unified command. A counterattack plan should have been drafted before our attack, and a senior commander should have been put in charge. A traffic jam may have delayed the Germans more than the Marathas had, and Rommel had to come up to the front to help clear the mess that they got themselves into. The British artillery hadn't actually fired at the Germans yet for 2 reasons. One, there was inadequate pre-battle coordination between the artillery and the forward units, and 2, the artillery had wanted to wait until they could see the enemy tanks in order to be more accurate with their shots. So it was only when the panzers rolled north, mistaking some Indian Bren carriers for tanks on the way, that they were finally fired upon by the guns of the 25th Field Regiment. During this engagement, 21st Panzer Division ran into a minefield and was halted, while 15th Panzer Division, spurred on by General Neering, pushed up on the left wing as the British realised that they didn't have enough shells. Far too much ammunition was still at the main dumps and not at the guns. We had much difficulty in getting permission to dump 200 rounds per gun and fired it all on June 20th. Refusing to advance into the exposed ground beyond the blue line to help the forward units, Reeves now moved his battalion to the road running through the minefields, and placed his tanks in hull-down positions. At this point, with the commanders probably realising that this was the main attack, Foot's 7th Royal Tank Regiment moved up and reinforced Reeves. Both commanders talked and they agreed that the situation was serious but not desperate. They believed that the Germans could be stopped at the blue line and decided not to counterattack. When Foot went to see Anderson, Anderson agreed with the plan, but he asked for tank reinforcements for the Cameron Highlanders, so B Squadron from 7th Royal Tank Regiment was sent to support them. At this point, Anderson sent yet another over-optimistic message to General Klopper, confirming that this was the main attack, and that a counterattack was being set up. Klopper therefore believed his counterattack had been ordered in good time, and he sent 2 artillery batteries to the King's Cross area, and an anti-tank battery to support the 25th Field Regiment. But otherwise, Klopper did nothing else at this point. Up until now, the Germans had been overcautious due to the fear of the minefields, some of which they had run into. But just before noon, the Germans found gaps in them and started to advance. General von Bismarck reconnoitred the minefield in person and discovered a gap through which, travelling as he was accustomed in the sidecar of a motorcycle, he led his tanks. Rommel himself was also close behind the advance and ready to take over at a critical moment. I stress this element of personal leadership because British and South African accounts show that no senior officer of the 2nd South African Division, the 32nd Army Tank Brigade, or the 201st Guards Brigade ever went near King's Cross. The defending troops fought with great gallantry, but without leadership or direction. Matilda tanks came out through the gaps in the minefield to try to get within range with their puny 2-pounders. But the anti-tank screen soon stopped them, and when the leading Mark IIIs opened up as well, the Matilda crews could be seen jumping from their turrets and racing back towards some form of safety. The 3 German formations smashed through the blue line, with 21st Panzer Division just annihilating Reeves' tanks. Reeves himself fled to King's Cross to tell them that his command had been destroyed, and the remaining 6 tanks of his battalion were subordinated to Foot's battalion, which were also pushed aside. By about 1 PM, all the British artillery on the blue line was destroyed, and the 3 German forces pushed on to King's Cross. Here, 28 British and South African 25-pounder artillery pieces prepared to face 2 entire German panzer divisions, plus a brigade of infantry. Well, because most of the British and South African guns had only just arrived, they hadn't had time to dig in properly, so although this was the most serious opposition the Germans had encountered so far, the British simply weren't prepared. Therefore, German infantry and tanks cooperated together to take King's Cross, drove the British and South African artillerymen from their guns, and then swept over the infantry. Despite being wounded multiple times, there is a report stating that the gunners did fight on until killed, or their pieces were destroyed, and they may have knocked out a small number of panzers, but they were simply in a hopeless situation. 3 men remained on number 2 gun, Sergeant Johnson, Grenadier T.R. Phillips and Lieutenant Farr. An attempt was made to put down a smokescreen at point-blank range to permit a withdrawal of the remaining personnel, wounded and unwounded, on foot, but the gun was hit by a 50mm shell. The gun was put out of action, and Grenadier Phillips had his arm blown off, while Lieutenant Farr and Sergeant Johnson, apart from being stunned, escaped injury. On leaving the gun, Lieutenant Farr was wounded in the leg, and Grenadier Phillips is reported to have been killed by a subsequent shell. Anderson's and Pope's headquarters were scattered and fell back to Tobruk. And while the timing might be off, by about 2 PM, King's Cross was in German hands. So, seeing this development, B Squadron from the 7th Royal Tank Regiment, which had been sent to support the Cameron Highlanders, was recalled and destroyed en route, probably by the Ariete Division, which reported that it had battled some British tanks that had turned up in what they described as a stubborn fight. As Group Many was pulled back and moved to the right wing, Rommel himself drove up and stood up in his car looking down at the town of Tobruk below. He must have known that nothing could stop him now from taking the prize that he had wanted for so long. His rival, General Klopper, was frantically reporting what he knew back to 8th Army headquarters, which wasn't much because communications with the troops in the western portion of the fortress had all but collapsed. He didn't know that the Germans were at King's Cross, and he admitted in his report at 2 PM that what information he had was 3 hours behind current events. Well, Klopper now set about trying to form a new defence line at Fort Pilastrino, and Brigadier Hayton was given command of the 2nd Camerons and the Beer Group. Both Hayton and Cooper were ordered to send a company each to this new line, which betrays the fact that Klopper still hadn't grasped the severity of the situation. It was probably only at 3 PM or thereabouts when Brigadier Willison rang up and told Klopper that his entire force had been wiped out and was asking for permission to break out of the pocket, that Klopper realised just how desperate things actually were. Anderson then arrived and informed Klopper about the destruction of the Marathas and the isolation of the Gurkhas. One of Klopper's staff officers also pointed out that the transport lorries for the garrison were parked at the coast just south of Tobruk. So, if the Germans now raced to Tobruk, which they had no reason not to, these would be cut off and taken, and there would be no viable way for the garrison to escape. Well, that's exactly what the Germans now did. While their artillery shelled Tobruk, the 21st Panzer Division went north along the road towards the town, and after descending the first escarpment, they engaged the remnants of 7th Royal Tank Regiment in what was probably the last tank engagement during the battle. They easily overwhelmed them and pressed on, facing 15 South African 25-pounder artillery guns and 3 or 4 British 3.7-inch anti-aircraft guns guarding the landing grounds. These offered stiff resistance, delaying the Germans by a good hour, but ultimately the British weren't able to hold on. The eastern airfield, which was acting as a supply dump, was taken, and the panzers rolled over the NAFI supply area, much to their delight. There were pears from Australia, apricots, peaches and pineapple from California, cigarettes from Egypt, chocolate from England, milk, beer, ham and mountains of corned beef. We could live for 2 weeks from these crates. Meanwhile, 15th Panzer Division advanced towards Fort Pilastrino. Because the rocky soil in this area prevented the British from digging in, they had to rely on sandbags for protection, which weren't sufficient by themselves. So, the anti-tank guns were just sat in the open and made easy targets for the oncoming panzers. The Germans therefore overran the Sherwood Foresters and Coldstream Guards, capturing the 201st Guards Brigade headquarters not long after. Only Major Sainthill and 1 company from the Coldstream Guards, plus other elements, managed to fall back to Fort Pilastrino, but otherwise 2 battalions had been wiped out in an incredibly short space of time. Mistaking 201st Guards Brigade's headquarters as the garrison of Fort Pilastrino, the 15th Panzer Division mistakenly believed that they were at Gabagazm, when in reality they were further east than there. They therefore reported to Rommel that Fort Pilastrino wanted to capitulate, and this is why some of the old pro-German sources say that Fort Pilastrino was taken when in reality it actually wasn't. Well, Rommel then made the mistake of assuming that the whole of the Tobruk garrison wanted to surrender shortly, which no doubt influenced his next decision, which was to redirect the 15th Panzer Division northwards. Because 21st Panzer Division wanted to head north and needed support to do so, and because Rommel believed Fort Pilastrino was about to surrender anyway, 15th Panzer Division was ordered north towards Fort Solaro as originally planned. It was then replaced in the line by the Ariete Division, sparing Fort Pilastrino from a direct attack. At Fort Solero, there were 3 British 3.7-inch anti-aircraft guns, which were the equivalent to the infamous German 88mm guns that could destroy any tank on the battlefield. However, the British High Command had decided in their ultimate wisdom not to use them in the anti-tank role, and so the British remained outgunned with their 2 and 6 pounders. But the captain in charge of the guns at Fort Solero went against these orders, and even though they didn't have any anti-tank ammunition, he fired his guns at the enemy tanks coming towards them. 2 German panzers were destroyed and another 3 were damaged, momentarily halting the 15th Panzer Division. They caused severe casualties among the panzer crews, replied with hellish fire to a demand for surrender, and in the end were only put out of action by a storming party led with enormous gallantry by Rommel's own driver, which stole up under cover and then rushed the emplacements amid a shower of hand grenades. A single platoon of protected British infantry there might have made history. Well, seeing the 15th Panzer Division take Fort Solero, which was not that far away, Klopper's staff hastily burned their documents. In the process, they also destroyed most of their radio sets, and because of this, from this moment onwards, Klopper was no longer able to communicate with his troops. The command and control completely broke down, as Klopper and his staff then retreated to the 6th South African Brigade's headquarters to try and continue the fight. The irony of this was that, because they were exhausted, 15th Panzer Division didn't actually take the area where Klopper's headquarters had been, meaning the South Africans had destroyed their radio sets for nothing. With their flank now secure, at 5 PM, 21st Panzer Division's artillery ceased firing at Tobruk, and 15 minutes later the division advanced down the last escarpment. Rear area troops grabbed their rifles and set up roadblocks, but they only delayed the inevitable. The Germans entered the port at 6 PM, at which point Brigadier Thompson, the guy in charge of the supply dumps, obtained permission to set off their port's demolition charges, damaging but not destroying the harbour and supply facilities. Most of the craft escaped to Alexandria under fire, although 1 boat was sunk in the harbour and another, the Parktown, was sunk by a German E-boat the next day. Some of the old sources based on German accounts say that more ships were destroyed, but those ships were probably already sunk before the siege had even begun. Brigadier Thompson was captured while firing his machine gun on the roof of a house, and at 7 PM Rommel announced that the port of Tobruk was finally in his hands. He also reported that Fort Solero and Fort Pilastrino were taken, and the German press just ran with it, even though only Solero had fallen. Now, because the 15th Panzer Division thought Pilastrino had offered to surrender, and because Rommel misinterpreted this to mean that Klopper was about to give in, he ordered his troops to rest for the evening, likely thinking that the surrender would come first thing in the morning. They had been fighting constantly since the 26th of May, so his troops were completely exhausted and just needed a break. So tired were they that cut-off British units and individuals made their way past the sleeping Germans, in some cases straight through their campsites without disturbing them. Had the understanding of the situation, the resolution, and above all the means of command to initiate and execute action existed, a night attack by the considerable numbers of infantry available against the exhausted and somnolent tank and gun crews of the Afrika Korps might have had remarkable results. I found confusion everywhere. About 6 PM, the CO of the Pretoria Police Battalion arrived, fuming with rage and frustration. He had been organising his battalion into tank hunting groups, but had then received an order not to do so. "Why?" he asked. "Has Tobruk surrendered?" No one could tell him. I found the men of the South African Division itching to fight. In my opinion, if only the men had been allowed to go in, I feel the outcome could well have been different. As it was, the South African Division sat tight and did nothing. Even though Klopper had been sending signals to the 8th Army from 10:45 AM, it looks like the 8th Army didn't receive them until the late afternoon. And because he was out visiting his corps commanders, Ritchie only got this information at about 6 PM. At 6:15, he finally replied to Klopper, giving what can only be described as a very optimistic and out-of-date assessment. He promised that air support would soon be given, and said he would do all he could from the outside to relieve pressure on the garrison. Another message from 8th Army asked for clarity. Did Klopper's previous message imply that Klopper had lost all of his tanks, or that the enemy had lost all their tanks? I mean, it's a stupid question because there's no way that Rommel would have lost all his tanks taken to Tobruk, and it's irrelevant anyway because it looks like 2nd South African Division never received these messages, but it highlights just how out of touch the British command was at this time. Trying to resolve the situation in the south, Brigadier Hayton of the 4th South African Brigade told Page of the Kaffrarian Rifles to make contact with Beer Group and the Cameron Highlanders. Unfortunately, after this order, the Kaffrarians' wireless link was destroyed by a shell, restricting communications between them and Hayton. The subsequent silence made Hayton assume that these units had been destroyed, and so Hayton moved his headquarters to the Fig Tree area overnight in confusing circumstances. This effectively left the 4th South African Brigade without a central command at this critical moment. Unable to contact Hayton, White of 3rd South African Field Regiment took the initiative. He and Sherwell of the 2nd Field Regiment pulled back their 50 or so guns to Fort Pilastrino in order to mount an effective defence there. And Klopper sent this message to the 8th Army that evening. "My HQ surrounded. Infantry on perimeter still fighting hard. I'm holding out, but I do not know for how long." He had no communication with the rest of the garrison, who were all still fighting where they stood, including the Gurkhas, now trapped in their own separate pocket. In fact, Klopper didn't yet want to surrender. He still had 2 brigades of South African infantry, and although he had no tanks, he did have some armoured cars and a good amount of artillery. But while Klopper had originally wanted to continue resistance in the western portion of the fortress, that evening he changed his mind. Perhaps a breakout would be the better option rather than a last stand. The British command outside the pocket was still completely clueless about what was going on, as Ritchie's message to Auchinleck at 6 PM illustrates. "I feel strongly that enemy intends to attack Tobruk at once, if he has not already done so." Ritchie also ordered 7th Armoured Division to strike towards Sidi Rezai, and while these moves look impressive on the map, realistically, the Axis lines, guarded by the Pavia infantry and newly arrived Littorio armoured divisions, were not in danger of being breached by what was essentially 3 jock columns. A rumour spread about the garrison that said that Gott had messaged, "Hold on, I'm coming, Gott." But this was a rumour only. Gott never sent that message. And even though Klopper had got his wireless working again, there were still communication issues due to poor signals and the use of out-of-date codes. And when 8th Army Staff Officer Brigadier Whiteley asked Klopper for an update and asked him if things were in hand, Klopper replied, "Situation not in hand. Counterattack with infantry battalion tonight. All my tanks gone, half my guns gone. Do you think it advisable I battle through? If you are counterattacking, let me know." As the clock ticked over to the 21st of June 1942, Whiteley explained where the 8th Army's lines were, but said he would prefer it if they only broke out the next night. It's not clear how Klopper interpreted this message, but he conferred with his subordinates and they were divided on what to do. Hayton and his battalion commanders pointed out that they had no vehicles, which had been captured, and they couldn't break out on foot. They instead preferred to stand and fight. Brigadier Cooper was nonetheless willing to attempt a breakout, while other officers thought that holding on was pointless because the artillery only had the ammunition in their limbers, which wouldn't last long. The infantry lines were facing west and were defenceless from an attack from the east. They therefore suggested that all mobile troops, at the very least, should attempt a breakout. Some officers actually worked out a plan by which the 2 or 3 surviving tanks would lead a breakout, followed by the armoured cars and artillery. Another officer is reported to have pleaded tearfully and emphatically for immediate surrender, urging on the general that his was the responsibility for preserving the cream of South African manhood. At 2 AM on the 21st of June 1942, Klopper gave the order for some mobile troops to attempt a breakout, and at the same time he sent this message to the 8th Army. "I'm sending mobile troops out tonight. Not possible to hold tomorrow. Mobile troops nearly naught, enemy captured vehicles. Will resist to last man and last round." But the debate continued between Klopper and his officers, with the officers arguing amongst themselves. Klopper's brigadiers were more experienced than him, and they began to make their own decisions and disregard his orders. The chain of command broke down, and when Brigadier Hayton was informed by his subordinates that they only had 2 hours worth of ammunition left, he changed his mind about fighting on and informed Klopper that he was going to give up. Klopper replied, "No, Alec, you can't do that. You're putting us in a hell of a jam. You must fight. Go and speak to them again and ring me." After this, Hayton said he would fight on. But having not heard from Ritchie for 3 hours, by 6 AM, Klopper had realised that he didn't have control of the situation anymore, and that prolonged resistance in their exposed positions wouldn't really benefit the 8th Army and would just lead to excessive casualties for the South Africans. At about this time, General Ritchie finally managed to get back in contact with Klopper, saying, "Noted about mobile elements. In respect, remainder every day and hour of resistance materially assists our cause. I cannot tell tactical situation and must therefore leave you to act on your own judgment regarding capitulation. Report if you can extent to which destruction POL effected." Klopper replied, "Situation shambles. Terrible casualties would result. I'm doing the worst. Petrol destroyed." Turns out the petrol wasn't destroyed, but Klopper probably didn't know that. Ritchie therefore said, "Whole of 8th Army has watched with admiration your gallant fight. You are an example to us all, and I know South Africa will be proud of you. God bless you, and may fortune favour your efforts wherever you may be." Klopper therefore approached the Germans for surrender on what was Auchinleck's 58th birthday. When the troops saw the white flag hoisted above the 6th Brigade headquarters, the South African police let out a moaning cry of despair. It really does seem like the troops wanted to continue the fight. Many were in disbelief, which makes sense because most of the South African infantry hadn't actually fought the day before. The majority of the fighting so far had been conducted by British and Indian troops, supported by British and South African artillery, plus a few armoured cars. The bulk of the South African infantry was still fresh, and were taken completely by surprise. The first reaction to the orders to cease fire and destroy all equipment was invariably one of blank amazement. There is evidence that one group with the South African police took the first order to destroy transport as a preliminary, like the burning of a Viking's boat, to fighting it out where they stood. The troops burned their trucks first, as ordered, and then wondered how they were meant to attempt an escape. The remaining South African armoured cars were driven off the edge of the cliff at the coast, and the troops smashed their rifles before giving in. Sherwell of the 2nd Field Regiment, who was busy shelling the Germans at the time, refused to accept the orders when he was first given them, and the officer giving the orders over the phone broke down in tears. Sherwell said he would only accept the order to surrender from Klopper himself. But when the Germans did advance, his makeshift position was quickly overrun. By mid-morning, orders had been received by all units to cease firing and to lay down their arms. Tobruk had surrendered. The fortress that had previously withstood siege for 7 months had resisted for just 1 day. But not all troops surrendered. The southern units attempted to break out, although most weren't successful. But some small groups and individuals did break out and return to Egypt. The only major unit to do so was Major St. Hill's group from the Coldstream Guards. They gathered 60 vehicles and other men from other units and burst out the perimeter to the southwest. They were hit by heavy fire from the Italians, suffering some casualties, but were concealed by the dust and smoke, so were able to keep going. They found a pass at the escarpment about 10 miles west, then headed south before being picked up by the South African armoured cars operating with 7th Armoured Division. In all, 405 men of this group made it back alive. There were some notable lesser attempts. Lieutenant L. Bailey and Sergeant G. R. Norton of the Kaffrarian Rifles, with a small party, reached the El Alamein position 38 days after the fall of Tobruk. Sergeants J. H. Brown and C. A. Turner of the Coldstream Guards, who, in carriers, had fallen behind Major St. Hill's column, struggled on and brought their men and machines safely in. Another adventurous party from the 2nd Royal Durban Light Infantry captured a German tank in the course of their travels and made a prisoner of their own account. With 9 men hanging onto my little truck, I found an opening, driving through the cordon of enemy units advancing on Tobruk. After a hectic drive of about 70 miles, in which we had to dodge enemy columns and vehicles, we met a patrol from an Indian brigade and realised that we had fooled the Hun and were safe. The Gurkhas and the Cameron Highlanders refused to surrender entirely and fought on in isolation. The bulk of the Gurkhas only gave in on the evening of the 21st, and at this point, many of them still didn't surrender and tried to flee east, only to be picked up by the Italians over the next several days. The Cameron Highlanders battled it out with the Ariete Division plus German elements until the morning of the 22nd, when they were threatened with extermination if they continued to resist. When the Camerons finally surrendered, they marched into captivity headed by their pipers, and the commander of the battalion lectured the unshaven German officer who came to collect them, throwing his revolver at his feet. It's interesting that it was the middle battalion of Anderson's Indian Brigade that got overwhelmed in the initial attack, but that it was the other 2 battalions of his brigade that continued to fight the longest. To me, this shows that the Indian troops were able and willing to fight, it's just that one battalion in poor defences couldn't hold against 4 Axis divisions. So we can't blame the fall of Tobruk on the poor quality of the Indian troops, because they weren't poor quality troops, they were good troops but placed in an impossible position. The exact number of prisoners is not known for certain, but it was probably about 33,000 men. The majority, 19,000, were British troops, with 2,500 Indians and 10,722 South Africans. This was the 2nd largest capitulation of British troops in the entire war, after Singapore. The blow to British and South African pride and morale was incalculable. South Africa had lost a third of all its forces in the field. A temporary POW cage was established at Derna, and, charitably, Rommel permitted Klopper to speak to his men. It was a large audience, and Klopper had to employ amplifying equipment and speak through a microphone. It must have come as a nasty shock to him when he was jeered and booed by his discontented fellow prisoners who believed that he had let them down. He had failed miserably and was party to a British defeat only eclipsed by the loss of Singapore. Churchill was with Roosevelt when he received a slip of paper with the news about Tobruk, and he felt disgraced. George Marshall proposed sending Patton and the US 2nd Armoured Division to Egypt, but this wasn't yet ready for combat. Instead, Roosevelt ordered that the American division be stripped of its 300 new Shermans, which were then gifted to the British, although they wouldn't arrive until later in the year. The fall of Tobruk was a huge political setback for Churchill, who now faced a vote of no confidence in the House of Commons. The motion failed, but he could no longer afford any more disasters like Tobruk or Singapore. There was also a mass panic in Cairo, causing strikes, unrest, food shortages, runaway inflation, and a mass exodus to Palestine, which became known as the Flap. German casualties for the siege of Tobruk aren't known because some of the primary sources are missing, but they only took 3,490 casualties from the 26th of May to the 21st of June. So in terms of manpower, they must have been light. This was just 15% of their overall strength, although many of them were officers, which was especially bad for the panzer units. After the war, General Bayerlein, Rommel's chief of staff, guessed that they had only lost 20 tanks in Tobruk. But if we look at the numbers, they had 125 tanks prior to the attack and 44 operational panzers after it, along with 14 Italian tanks. Some of them had definitely broken down, and many were subsequently repaired, but it's clear that they had lost more than just 20. They did capture 20 or 30 British tanks though, mainly from 32nd Army Tank Brigade's repair shops, which no doubt boosted their numbers, even if they were only Matildas and Valentines. The booty captured at Tobruk and Belheim and in various dumps in the desert gave the Germans practically everything they needed except for water. The Panzer Army's figures show that of a total of over 2,000 tons of fuel, about 1,400 tons were found at Tobruk and only 20 tons at Belheim. Large quantities of ammunition, both British and German, were found, together with some 2,000 serviceable vehicles and about 5,000 tons of provisions. The British envoys for the surrender of Tobruk first ran into the Italian 21st Corps, who told them to go to Rommel's headquarters. This prompted Mussolini to publish an account of the surrender of Tobruk in the morning of the 21st of June that created the impression that this was essentially an Italian victory. Hitler was furious, and to demonstrate to all the world that this was a triumph of German arms, he promoted Rommel to Field Marshal. Rommel was 50 years old when he was promoted to General Feldmarschall on the 22nd of June 1942, making him the youngest Field Marshal in the German army and one of the youngest in the entire history of Germany. He was now superior in rank to Cavallero and Bastico, the Italian generals, and equal in rank to Kesselring. He had gone from colonel to Field Marshal in just 3 years, which was a meteoric rise in rank, perhaps too quickly. Nonetheless, the morale boost in the Panzer Army and to Germany as well was immense, with Morrill describing how this was the high point of the African War for his troops. It would also turn out to be the climax of his own career, his greatest military achievement. Public spirits in Germany rose to a level not seen since the fall of France in 1940, and Rommel became famous throughout the world overnight, with his troops basking in the glory. We celebrated with captured tinned fruit, Irish potatoes, cigarettes, and canned beer. For a day or so we rejoiced in the blessings of the British Navy. It was a pleasure to snuffle around the field kitchens where pork, sausages and potatoes, so long a rarity, were being fried. There was British beer to drink and tinned South African pineapples for dessert. We spurred our own rations, especially Alta Man, with distaste and contempt. Instead, we gloried in Australian bully beef, of which the Australians were as sick as we were of Alta Man. Surprisingly, Rommel's initial reaction was fury. He was angry that the British had destroyed most of their trucks and fuel supplies, which would limit his advance to the east. He actually berated General Klopper, much to the embarrassment of his staff, and then cut short the victory celebrations by ordering his troops to drive east. Rommel believed that the British couldn't stop him from reaching the Suez Canal, which was based on Colonel Bonner Feller's assessment, which Rommel was reading. Bonner Fellers was the US military attaché in Egypt, and the Italians had gotten the American codes allowing the Axis to listen in on him. The British had been decisively beaten, and the time was ripe for Rommel to take Cairo and the Nile Delta. The Italians agreed that Rommel had a good chance of success. So, when Kesselring met with Rommel on the 21st after the battle to discuss future strategy, Rommel was already determined to advance into Egypt. Kesselring, on the other hand, had ordered his air units back to the west so that he could take on Malta, which was meant to have been the next step. Prior to this moment, there hadn't been enough fuel to take Malta and support Rommel at the same time. The Axis had to do one or the other. So an argument between Rommel and Kesselring ensued, as did one with the Italians, to figure out what should happen next. And to cut a long story short, Rommel got his way. This was because Rommel appealed directly to Hitler and Mussolini, bypassing and outmaneuvering Kesselring and the other Italian commanders. We'll come back to discuss this decision and its consequences in the next Battlestorm video, which will show the German advance and the British retreat to El Alamein. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and check out my other Battlestorm and history videos for more in-depth analyses like these. Thanks for watching, bye for now.